Dr. Michael Beeman is a visiting scholar here at the Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center. His research and writing is focused on trade policy issues such as economic security between the United States and Asia. He also serves as a lecturer with the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy program. Before coming to APARC, he was Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. In that role, he led the renegotiation of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement and the U.S.-Japan Trade Agreement, among other initiatives. His new book, Walking Out: America's New Trade Policy in the Asia-Pacific and Beyond, is a detailed account of the origins and characteristics of America's policy choices since the mid-2010s that are fundamentally transforming its foreign trade policy. Molded by America's hyper-polarized domestic politics, these choices are also reshaping and resetting many of its foreign relationships and engagements. Dr. Beeman, thank you for doing a Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center book talk.
Great, thanks for having me.
So tell me, why did you choose the title Walking Out? On what and on whom is America walking out?
Well, to my mind, walking out perfectly summarizes the new choices America is making in its foreign trade policy. So what is walking out, right? People, but also countries, walk out in many different situations. They walk out in protest to some condition or some situation that they find objectionable and not able to live with. Other times it's a tactic. It's a tactic to try and renegotiate terms, renegotiate obligations to get a better deal or to get something else that it wants instead. So sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes having leverage obviously helps a great deal sometimes, or some other favorable development. But oftentimes when it doesn't work, an individual or a country walks out and they find themselves on the outside and kind of in the situation of a permanent rift with a more permanent solution to their concern kind of left unaddressed. So the irony in this, in terms of who or what America is walking out on, is, of course, trade agreements, the WTO, many different ways America is walking out. But actually, in fact, what America really is walking out on are many of the conditions, obligations, and norms that Washington itself long insisted others agree to and agree on and to honor to make trade fair, equitable, and mutually beneficial. So America led efforts to shape these obligations and norms out of the tragedies of the first half of the 20th century. It did so, of course, to advance its own interests, but it also did so in great part to avoid a repeat and return to the trade tensions that really helped ignite global conflict in the earliest 20th century. So America further updated these rules and norms over time to add more demands and more rules, insisting they emulate the US system and its own rules based on principles of non-discrimination, transparency, openness, and reciprocity. But rather than continue to build on those rules and norms further to shape global trade and to continue to build out, America is now choosing to reject many of those same norms and rules and obligations, and it's walking out. So this is far different than just failing to agree to a particular trade deal. It's a deeper rejection of many of the assumptions and goals America championed for about 75 years to create a system of mutually beneficial global trade. And so it really is a rejection, ironically, of America's own past and its own values and its own principles in pursuit of other goals and new goals. And so that is why I chose the topic and the title.
Thanks for that answer. A common perception, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, is that the US-China geopolitical rivalry is driving change in US trade policy. Yet, you argue that these changes are primarily driven by domestic factors in America. Why is that?
Yeah, well, I mean, China is an enormous problem in terms of trade, in terms of the global economy. China's economic rise was, of course, aided by its acceptance over 20 years ago into the international trading system. And, this is the system that America helped build and define the rules for. But then I think it's also very fair to say and problematic that it unfairly then advantaged itself with a litany of highly problematic and predatory practices. gratuitous among those that are, pretty gratuitous have been intellectual property theft, mass state involvement and subsidization of its industries, and exploitation of its workers is just a few examples. So it is a big problem. And the United States, but also many other countries are really reassessing and revisiting how they decide to engage with China, both to mitigate these impacts and risks, but also to remain open to whatever potential opportunities there may be to engage in trade with China. So my book talks a great deal about the depth of the China challenges and how it absolutely is driving many of the policy decisions that are being made in Washington. My book, however, also underscores many other cases where America is walking out, even though China is really not a significant factor or not even at the table. I mean, if you just listen to the Trump and the Biden administrations and what they've said, and many in US Congress who are invoking other reasons other than China to justify walking out, that begins to become very clear. It could be the environment, the trade deficit, sovereignty, policy space, the quote unquote race to the bottom, globalization, economic security. So there's really a large number of other reasons that are being cited and used to justify these decisions to walk out in many different ways. So why is that then? Much focus has been placed on America's exceptional political polarization and how it's channeled mainstream political assumptions into zero-sum arguments and beliefs, really transforming the US domestic and foreign policy in terms of the choices that are being made. So a major political shift really has happened, and I think that is undeniable in the United States. So it's not necessarily surprising that my book finds these zero-sum dynamics showing up in our 75-year-long bipartisan support for more open and rules-based trade and overturning that consensus, basically in terms of trying to find something new and define something new. So in short, in the zero-sum world, the United States is really defining trade as in its external or foreign dimension as an us versus them proposition. So instead of the mutually beneficial approach that the US took to global trade after World War II, in its foreign dimension now we have this us versus them, and there's a new rough alignment in the views of the far left and the far right on the need to prioritize things like raising new tariffs, erecting new walls, in defining trade in these more zero-sum terms as winners or losers, even if trade is increasing or doing better with certain countries or overall, to the extent that others are doing even better than that, it becomes a liability or is viewed as a liability. In the domestic dimension, however, that alignment becomes conflict. It becomes conflict because trade policy also has enormous domestic economic implications. And in that space, there's an enormous battle going on over the status quo in the United States over things like business regulation or labor union rights or the environment, for example. And those issues over the rules of the game by which the US, has tried to engage others and demand others accept are really under a great deal of stress and a great deal of conflict for domestic reasons. And so those fights are manifesting themselves in the global space. And so what you get is flip-flopping. You get, supporting a position in one administration and completely retracting it in the next administration. You get this really strong inconsistency in an ability to articulate a vision for the future of what America wants in trade because it's changing depending on parties in power and the rest. So that is a very different kind of dynamic than we had in the past, which was, of course, it was never a perfect consensus, but the bipartisan consensus continued to support a general direction and a general approach. And now that general direction and general approach is really defined by, erecting new walls to America's market wherever feasible and possible, while not being able to agree on a vision for the future.
I see. And what are the potential consequences or implications for global trade and economic stability if America continued down this path of prioritizing unilateral trade policies over its international commitments in the trade rules and in trade norms?
Right. Well, I mean, I think the implications have already been quite large and are potentially even more enormous. Particularly if the United States continues down the path that it's on and continues to pursue these similar kinds of approaches. The international trading system already was in a really difficult state. It was really in a static state, with little being able to be accomplished, little able to be negotiated and agreed upon. So countries began to really focus on doing more deals with one another and solving their own problems among themselves. Um, well, the United States has really kind of turned away certainly from the World Trade Organization and its trade commitments there. And as it's done that, it's really piled on to the problems that the WTO already has had and continues to have, and added to the fragmentation of the global trading system in a way, and really helps accelerate it, I think, in a way that is hard to predict where this will go. But I think if it continues down the path, it is a particularly perilous approach. And I say that because, again, reminding of where we came from in history and how we got here and why the United States did the things that it did and took the principles that it took to try and preserve the system. Because now almost every day I will read or see or someone speak or read an op-ed of some sort with someone advocating a position of basically doing something that completely violates the trade rules in order to achieve a certain objective here in the United States. This happens a lot in other countries as well. So the United States is absolutely not alone in this. And oftentimes these have very good reasons and very, smart goals in mind to try and achieve. But by opening the floodgates, I think by walking out and continuing to walk away from trade obligations as a critical priority to try and maintain as it finds solutions to deal with problems is, a really is a kind of a perilous path, as I would argue, down a route that the U.S. firmly rejected, 75, 80 years ago, in order to try and create a new system where a sense of mutually beneficial trade was possible. So, this is, I think, is the direction that is unfortunately undergoing that we're on the path to at the moment. And, I think there's a lot of caution that needs to be given in further thoughts about how to achieve America's objectives and actually, and to pressure others to achieve their objectives in a way that also keep this in mind.
In light of that accelerated fragmentation, what other approaches could America take to meet its current priorities? And what recommendations do you have for US trade policy moving forward?
I believe the US is best served by maintaining what I call a muscular trade policy. What is that? In my mind, it's a trade policy that I don't believe we have at the moment, but it's also a trade policy that I don't believe really necessarily represents the need to threaten and punch in ways that may solve one problem for the short term, but create 10 more down the road in other ways. As a former U.S. trade official, I really do think the United States needs a very strong and muscular policy. But what I mean by this are having the arguments, the tools. At times, it means having the leverage. It means having the leadership and the vision. It means being able to shape the world in a way that is still serving the U.S. interests and dealing with problems as they arise, and not waiting, but also to shape the world in a way that other countries are also able to see it as is in their own interest. So I believe the United States is really uniquely positioned to do that, but is really not, capably doing that at the moment. A policy shaped by the ends and means of walking out without an alternative vision to replace it, I don't believe accomplishes this. In my view, the road back to kind of a redefined and clearer and more productive trade policy is one that 100% has to begin in the United States. It has to begin in with domestic economic priorities and concerns, and it has to reflect either a refreshed or a new bipartisan consensus on what that kind of vision aims to achieve. And so, but I think it cannot be one that is zero sum, and that is where we are at the moment. That allows so as to allow for compromise among different and competing interests. I think that's the largest challenge, and regretfully, I don't see the United States being able to get to that place anytime in the very near term. So that is a domestic challenge and a domestic problem, but I do believe that the resolution of it does need to start here with a stronger consensus around our own economic priorities, both foreign and domestic. In the near term, I do think that how the United States deals with China probably does and will require continuing to go off the script from this rule book. I think is justified in doing so. And I think there are moments when those cases are called for. But I also think for others with whom we have disagreements, we've had trade disagreements for many decades, but there are nothing on the scale of what we deal with China is or makes the case for returning to at least minimally the non-discrimination principle, respecting that, respecting solving problems through negotiation and sometimes confrontation, but confrontation with an eye towards solving the problem and not just or dealing with it in a zero-sum fashion. So I think that is the starting point, because without the non-discrimination principle, I think we are at risk of an even greater fragmentation of the system in a way that is going to not end well for the United States and others.
I see. And with all of this in mind, what do you hope that readers will take away from your book?
So one objective that I have, obviously, is to help answer a fundamental question that I've heard and seen around a lot and seen a lot of different explanations for, which is really the question of what happened to U.S. trade policy. That's my short question about it, which is, and really over the past decade, because there are fundamentally different choices and decisions being made than we've seen in the past. So why is that, and what is going on? So the book really attempts to lay out, what policymakers were thinking, what their objectives were, what the challenges were, what the pushback was, how these decisions were made, and why decisions were not made, in order to help shape a better understanding of why America is walking out and making these new trade policy choices.
Well, thank you, Dr. Beeman, for a robust discussion of America's trade policy choices. And for all of those listening, be sure to pick up your copy of Walking Out, America's New Trade Policy in the Asia-Pacific, published by APARC and distributed by Stanford University Press.